Hello, family members. Hope you're having a nice day today. I want to talk to you today about music. I was watching FD Signifier. I don't remember what video, but he said something to the effect of like, "Hey, white people, what happened to rock and roll? Where is our rock and roll?" And so I started thinking about that, and I kind of went on a journey. But I think I have the answer. So let's get into it. All right. I want to start out with a little bit of a story. Uh, I grew up as sort of the first MTV generation. I was alive before MTV was really a thing, but I really wasn't aware of what was going on with pop culture until it was fairly firmly established. There were musicians in like the late 70s, early 80s that were insanely popular that just could not make the transition to the MTV era. Part of it, it's just physical attractiveness. Honestly, it was just nothing more or less than that. It's just shallow stuff. But more than that, it was you had to have the ability to have some sort of artistic vision, something that would make your music videos worth watching. And I think in a lot of ways, we got a lot of really interesting art out of that era and continue to do so. You know, there's still occasionally the odd music video or visual album put out that is, you know, incredible. But, you know, there was a time when you could be a big name director of music videos. You'd have, you know, huge budget, and basically you're making a silent film set to a music song. I mean, some of them really did have like full on narratives and, you know, stories that were relatively interesting and deep in occasions. So, it wasn't necessarily all bad that MTV changed music. But there was something that was lost in the process. I I don't really know exactly when rock and roll kind of petered out, but I suspect that it may have been after the like new metal stuff. And then emo might have been really it. I didn't really get into the emo thing, so I can't really speak on that very much. But that might have really been the last time that rock had a heyday of sorts commercially. And I think the reason for that is kind of complicated, but it boils down to one thing: festivals. I think people who may have been rock stars in previous generations end up as like niche musicians in whatever genre truly speaks to them. And, you know, they gain fans by playing at festivals and then are able to build a career where they can, you know, make tour and support themselves outside of that. You see like jam bands, bluegrass, uh, jamgrass, Americana is a big one you see a lot. Um, and you even see it like historical genres kind of represented. You know, there's quite a lot of like pop punk, real punk, emo kind of mishmash kind of festivals that happen. And so that's where bands come up, and they never actually need record companies, you know? They make their money by touring, selling merch, and they, you know, probably get a little bit of money from like streaming and selling records and vinyl and stuff, but they're just working musicians, and they may not have like $1 million mansions, although some of the best of them will end up like that. The cream always rises to the top of the crop, right? But like they'll be able to have comfortable lives as musicians. And then, of course, there are the people who are just out there hustling. I have a cousin who is in 2 metal bands, and he has a full-time job and kids and a house and dog and all of the American dream stuff. And he's out there making music that he's really passionate about. And I don't imagine he necessarily makes that much money at all. But that's not the point. The point is to play and to have the shows and to be in the moment and enjoy that. I mean, he's the kind of person who goes to a lot of shows even when he's not the one who's playing, you know? Some people are just musicians, and they need to perform, and they need to see shows. And we kind of forget that that's what being a musician is. That's not being like a rock star signed to a big label making a ton of money, you know. It's not that. I think when I look kind of into this a little bit deeper, and also talking to my parents who are like huge bluegrass nerds, the thing I find interesting about it is this idea of rock and roll being a white people genre. When anyone who knows anything about rock and roll knows how like ridiculous that is. And so when I was kind of thinking about how like rock and roll had kind of subsided a little bit, and it seems like old school country, rock country, uh, um, jam country, bluegrass, all of that is kind of coming back. I was like, you know, there's an interesting dynamic, you know, rock and roll, which is something that was, you know, kind of stolen from black people, kind of fallen away. And, you know, we're going back to these older genres that actually are representative of white people. And my mom was like, no, 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 you got this wrong. Bluegrass, country music, all of that was developed in the hills, in isolated pockets. And it was just anyone who wanted to play music played music. And it was black people and white people. Because guess what? There's a lot of black people in the South, in the rural South. And historically, there was even more. So, bluegrass was a genre that was not developed by one particular race and didn't belong to white people or to black people. It belonged to hillbillies, belonged to people who were from those rural pockets. And it's only because there was this guy who decided to kind of take bluegrass and make it a commercial enterprise. And he only promoted white artists. He would not allow black artists to be part of that bluegrass story. He wrote them out. And as a result, they were pushed aside and they had to do their own thing. And when a group of people is oppressed and marginalized, they don't stop making art. Making art is an intrinsic human need. They're just people who will make art no matter what. It's just something they must do. And so when you have an oppressed, marginalized group that's been isolated, they come up with their own music, their own art. And of course, what happened? Again, white people found the good music, the good art that they were making, and decided to just take it and whitewash it and make money off of it. I mean, that's how you end up with an Elvis Presley. When people call him like the king of rock and roll, it's so hilarious because he's not. He's the thief that stole rock and roll from black people. Of course, it's not just him. It would have been other artists if it weren't just him. But that's the thing, is this idea of rock and roll as being like a white people genre, or anything being a white people genre, is so hilarious because music is just music. Artists are just artists. They make the art they make. There's no boundaries. And I wish that we were more willing to have those discussions. I mean, there are the odd musicians who are black in what are thought of as white genres. I mean, you have your Rihanna Giddens, Jimi Hendrix, although that's quite a deep cut, right? Prince, you could certainly say, oh my gosh, he was such a good guitar player, it's ridiculous. But, you know, for the most part, people try to kind of just gloss over the existence of people who don't fit a certain idea in a particular genre. And I don't think that the newer generations really like that idea. I think they just want to be authentic, you know? The musicians, the real musicians, you know? I mean, there's always going to be pop stars, people who want to be that world famous thing. That's sort of different. You can be a true musician and also a fame monster. But a lot of the people who want that fame aren't necessarily true musicians. You know, I think a good example of that would be maybe Britney Spears. Because I'll tell you, she is very talented, but her music is as good as her songwriter is. You know? Although I guess maybe when she wasn't so much in control of her career, that's not really something you can blame her for, huh? But, you know, I like, you know, some pop music. I do think that there's an interesting space for pop. But I certainly understand the frustrations of people who are like hip hop purists looking at pop rap and feeling like very betrayed by the fact that there's this representation of this genre that they love that is completely divorced from the priorities and the expectations of that genre. And the reason that I really came to understand that is I kind of related it to how I felt about punk rock music. When I was like in middle school or something, my little brother became interested in skating. West Virginia is usually about 10 years behind trends, and he was maybe a few years ahead. So that made him like light years ahead of a lot of other people. And so we had some exposure to that sort of like 90s, late 80s, 90s, like California West Coast skate rock or punk rock, you know, NoFX and Rancid and Bad Religion, Offspring, like early Offspring, um, The Descendants, Black Flag, Anti-Flag. There's a lot of them. There's a lot of really good, like, deep cut punk rock bands that, I remember my brother's, like, first CD being, like, NoFX or something like that. And so we're into punk rock, and then you start seeing the rise of Green Day. And Green Day, I love Green Day. I'll have to admit, like again, early Green Day, it's not their fault. I just kind of hopped off the train eventually because it just wasn't speaking to me the way it used to. But for like the first, I want to say 4 or 5 albums, I was pretty into Green Day. But there's no doubt that Green Day's like ridiculous runaway success brought pop punk into the forefront and became what people thought punk rock was. And I'm sorry, you can't be a rock star and be really, truly punk rock. Like, you just can't. It's not the amount of compromises you have to make in order to be a high level musician. The things that you can't say or do. No real punk would accept that. Like, honestly. And so seeing bands like Blink 182 and Sum 41 and worst of all, Avril Lavigne become what people thought punk rock was just horrifying to me. And I'm not trying to say you can't like those bands or that there was anything wrong with them, but they just weren't punk rock. They just weren't a good representation of what punk rock really is. But then again, was the 80s skate punk stuff, the 80s, 90s skate punk stuff that I liked, ultimate representation of punk? I mean, punk started in like the 70s, with like the Ramones and the Sex Pistols and stuff, and that kind of punk is pretty different. The Clash, pretty different than the stuff that I listen to, you know? Like genres change, but there's just something less authentic about the change from like old punk to like newer, now the 90s era punk that I liked, from that to pop punk. Because they're that priorities, those priorities. One thing I learned from FD Signifier again is about hip hop gatekeepers who were kind of the people who kept certain artists out or decided certain artists needed to be promoted or whatever. And punk just didn't have anything like that. And same thing for rock and roll. Rock and roll just didn't have anything like that. Didn't have gatekeepers to keep white people from stealing it from the subculture where it was born. I think that's what really killed rock and roll is the subgenres are all out there. They're all able to exist, coexist nicely, play at the same festivals. It always interests me looking at the lineup of festivals because sometimes the bands on the list just completely blow my mind. Like, wow. That's a strange combination, but people like have a broad, taste of things they'd like, and so going to a festival and seeing a whole bunch of bands, a bunch of them that you probably like, some that you're kind of familiar with, maybe some that you're not at all. You get to see new things. I mean, a lot of the shows that I went to that were like big shows were festivals. I went to Warped Tour several times, Ozfest several times. I went to a metal festival at Universal Studios once, which was really interesting. I got to see Megadeth. That was something. um, but that's what happened to rock and roll. Is the well-established bands are the ones that headline the festivals, and they might be people who were famous back in the MTV, rock radio days. And then you have, bands that have come up since then that might be on the lesser stages to start out. But if they're really good, they might work their way up. They might become the next Sierra Farrell or Billy Strings or uh, mm, Yonder Mountain String Band, maybe is a good example. Um, Although I don't know if they're still active or not. Anyway, I am way off my point here. But rock and roll isn't dead, it's just less commercial. It's more authentic. It's more about fans connecting with the music and with bands and going to shows and having a good time. One thing that my mom told me when I was, asking her about like bluegrass and stuff, and she said that a big part of the experience is the shakedown street, sort of like the tailgating of festivals and shows and things like that. It's people who follow the bands and set up little vendor tents and sell merchandise or crafts or food or all sorts of different things. It's that feeling of community. And I think that's kind of amazing. I think that it's interesting that that's where rock and bluegrass and all of these different subgenres have kind of ended up is in their own little bubbles where they can create their own little communities, you know? I think that the internet killed the video star. And when the video star went away, the last vestiges of rock as a commercial presence were lost as well. And, who knows, maybe that'll eventually happen to pop rap or pop country or anything like that. Maybe it'll get played out. And the only places you'll find it anymore is in the corners and the subgenres. And, it's like jazz. Jazz has never gone away. It's in little jazz clubs now instead of being like in musicals on big screen or whatever. You know, art art just changes over time, and the kind of casual fans drift away, but the hardcore still remain. you know? There's a Bobby Broccoli video about cold fusion, and and I know this seems kind of random, but he talks about how you can't kill an idea, that once an idea is out there, even if you discredit some sort of scientific theory, there'll still be people who might try to investigate that and think that it could be true. An idea is something you can't kill. Art is something you can't kill. Music is something you can't kill. Genre is something you can't kill. As long as there are people who still love a piece of art, a song, a band, a singer, whatever, then it's still alive. You know, I was also thinking about that when it comes to all these like sequels and reboots and everything that you see in movies. And I think that we need to stop, disparaging them so much, because that art, those stories, those characters, if the new generations don't know them, then they're functionally dead. They're gone. So essentially, when you do a remake or a reboot or whatever, you're keeping the story, that art alive. You're keeping it relevant. And whether or not you like whatever the new product is, it's going to keep people interested in that original product. I don't know, this is probably off topic too much, but I think it's somewhat relevant. Rock and roll. Yeah, I don't think that it's dead. I just don't think that there's anything that's just generic rock anymore. I think everything is more specific than that, because it's become more authentic, because it's become less commercial. And I think that's a good thing for rock and roll, or all of the genres that have spawned from it, I guess I should say. I wonder how much longer we're going to have much commercial music. It's kind of like the movies. They stopped making those middle budget movies. You'll see like little independent movies made, low budget, and then there's like these big gigantic blockbusters, but that middle part is gone. I think that's kind of happening to music too. The sort of moderately successful bands or artists aren't getting the industry development that they once did. And so they've found other ways to make a living and make their art. And I can't help but think that's like a really good improvement. Osprey. Baby. Come here, baby. Oh, yeah, that's my kitty. Come here. Come see mommy. Come on. Just like, I am not certain I want to do that. Well, that might be a sign that it's time for me to wrap it up anyway. All right, family members, you know, go to a show, like, just a local show, cheap, maybe even free. There's shows everywhere, even in rural places. You'll have a good time, even if you don't really necessarily like the music. You'll have a good time hanging out, being part of your community. All right, family members, I'll let you go. I hope you have a nice day and take care of yourselves. And community togetherness, community action.